This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Coming up on Dialogue Weekend, former UK Finance Minister Rishi Sunak becomes Britain's new Prime Minister after the dramatic resignation of Liz Truss. Who is Rishi Sunak and how will he tackle the UK's economic challenges? The 20th CPC National Congress concludes in Beijing. What is China's new blueprint for the future development of the Chinese market? And how will it help boost confidence in the global economy? Now, on Dialogue Weekend.
Hello and welcome to this edition of Dialogue Weekend. I'm Xu Qinduo. Rishi Sunak has become the United Kingdom's third Prime Minister in 7 weeks after his predecessor, Liz Truss, stepped down after just 45 days in office. How will Sunak lead the country out of its disastrous economic and political troubles, and will he continue Liz Truss' hardline approach on China? To help us answer these questions, I'm joined today by Professor John Gung from the University of International Business and Economics, David Mahon, Executive Chairman of Mahon China Investment Management, and John Ross, Senior Fellow of Chungyang Institute for Financial Studies of Renmin University of China. Welcome to this discussion. John, I will start with you. John in London. Rishi Sunak became the new Prime Minister of the UK, basically by virtue of being the only legitimate candidate for the position within the Conservative Party. But how will he be different in terms of policy making, in terms of what kind of policies he's going to put out from his predecessor, Liz Truss?
Well, the first thing he's going to try to do is try to avoid the disastrous mistakes of Liz Truss, which made her the shortest term Prime Minister in British history. What were these? It was Truss wanted to Americanize British society, we may put it that way. That is to reduce welfare, deregulate, introduce fracking, et cetera, move Britain closer to the United States in terms of foreign policy. But she tried to do it all at one go, in very short-term measures, all big package. And secondly, she didn't dare to make the cuts in social spending and other measures which would be required to produce an American economy. So therefore, she was going to try to borrow enormous quantities of money. And the international market said, we're not going to pay for your program. So therefore, her government collapsed because interest rates went soaringly high, the pound went down. He's going to pursue the same strategy as Liz Truss, but he's going to try to do it more cautiously, we may say, because he found out that she tried an adventure and it caused the collapse of her government. Mm-hmm.
Well, David, Sunak his background, is standing out, let's say, first Prime Minister of color, 42, the youngest Prime Minister in more than 200 years in the UK's history. He comes from a privileged background. He and his wife are basically among the richest people in the UK. What do you think of his background? How or in what way his background may or may not help deal with this crisis?
Well, in some ways, he's entirely different, as you've said, of any other British Prime Minister. And it's extraordinary, really, that it shows how much Britain has changed, that someone who is of Indian descent is now essentially the most powerful person in the country. Also, someone of Indian descent is the Mayor of London. I think Sunak is different than Liz Truss in many ways. As has been described, he's going to take things more slowly, but he is still a far-right conservative. And so I think for economic policies, we can expect something similar. As far as the stance on China, he is one of the early Brexiteers, and they were determined to have a good relationship with China. They saw leaving the EU as a way to be free to form free trade pacts with other countries. So I don't think there will be the same anti-China sentiment from him in the same strident way. But still, Britain is captive to America in many ways in foreign policy. So we shouldn't be too optimistic. And also, he is similar to those around him and those that have failed in what is exhausted political capital in the Tory party after 12 years. They're all people of tremendous privilege. Most went to Eton. He went to Winchester, which is a slightly lower ranked rival, but nonetheless a very exclusive private school. So you're still dealing with a ruling elite from which he is conditioned and derived.
Well, Professor Gong, joined in Shanghai. So both our speakers, previous speakers, have talked about his policies would be similar to that of Liz Truss, but he would be more cautious. Probably, I mean, the problems the UK is facing, they require that kind of a policy. But okay, being cautious, is that enough to deal with the problem?
Well, I think UK's economic problem is more structural and more of a long-term issue here. Ever since the Brexit, the economy has been stagnating. Um, Most of the advantages associated with EU has been gone now. It's trying to be on its own, so-called global Britain, and I don't think has been very successful. And it is especially so at the moment when you have high-flying inflation, and it's very difficult. You have try to do two things at the same time. On one hand, you want to keep economic growth. What it means is expansionary fiscal and monetary policy. On the other hand, you want to contain inflation. So I think his hands are very much tied at this point. And uh, I think he definitely learned the lesson. That too much of a aggressive plan is not going to fly with um, uh, the British society and has consequences on financial markets. So he probably be cautious. But I do agree that UK's economy has a structural problem, being essentially at this point uh, at the fringe, in my view, on the European vis-a-vis the European continent.
Well, John, in London, here, Sunak has moved swiftly to appoint his cabinet, including many who retain their current posts, as well as, quote, return of experienced hands. What do you think of his cabinet, his new cabinet? Do you think, he pledged to create unity within this fractured Conservative Party? Will he be able to do that? What requires him to do in order to have this unity inside this Conservative Party?
Well, in the short term, I think there will be more unity because the Conservative Party has just had a near-death experience, as you may put it. I mean, the support for the Conservative Party fell to 14% in the opinion polls, which I think is the lowest ever recorded for one of the major political parties in Britain. So I think they're all shocked and understand that enormous numbers of Conservative MPs will lose their seats if they have anything like that result. So I think at the moment they're all a bit scared and worried, and they will hang together. But it won't overcome the structural changes required. One or two of the more extreme Eurosceptics, for example, Rees-Mogg, for example, who's a key anti-EU person, has refused to serve in the government. And there will be a lot of moan-ins because there were attacks on Sunak. So I would expect about maybe 6 months of quiet, perhaps not even that, and then the fighting will start. The Daily Telegraph, which you might take to sort of the house organ of the Conservative Party, although it's officially an independent newspaper, is already carrying articles about behind the scenes, the knives are out. So as I say, a few months of quiet and then the fighting will start again.
So, I mean, will he be able to, of course, the Conservative Party and the British public expect the new Prime Minister and his cabinet to solve the problems, to alleviate the pain, let's say, high cost of living, etc. But can he do it like in the short-term period, at least to meet some of the expectations? Of course, there are long-term issues like problems remaining out of this Brexit, let's say. But that takes probably much longer to deal with, John.
Yes, certainly. In the short term, inflation is going to stay very high. It's fed by the very big price increases which have taken place in the United States and the very extreme expansionary policies in the United States, with the highest increases in money supply and the biggest budget deficits in US peacetime history. Sunak can't control that. So he's landed with a situation where inflation is going to remain high for some time, and that's bound to make his government unpopular. He can't deal with the structural questions either. Since Brexit, there's been no increase in British business investment, and British exports have been stagnant. Very logically, if you leave your largest trade market, don't expect your trade to do well. So he's a bit trapped in the situation. So there has to be an election by the end of 2024, and unless something very remarkable happens, he's going to lose the election. So it's not a very good prospect for Mr. Sunak, I'm afraid.
Mm-hmm. Well, John, in Shanghai, you talked about, you basically agree with another John. That's, very difficult for him to deal with that. But then does that mean a short-term, Sunak will become a short-term prime minister? Or he will probably achieve the unity of the Conservative Party and then win the general election against the Labour, maybe?
Well, I think his Chancellor of Czech is probably more competent than the previous one. And I think, just from reading public reports, I think there are enough confidence from the MPs that put him in this place. So I think at least in the short run, he's not going to take drastic measures, and there will be no drastic actions. And probably there's going to be no drastic change with respect to his position. He's a nice looking guy. He talks well. He seems to be quite popular with the public and with the MPs in the parliament. So I would expect that this sort of a honeymoon period will probably last a little bit longer than the 45 days that Truss has experienced, which is total disaster.
Yeah, hopefully. And David, you mentioned previously about his China policy. In his phone call with Joe Biden, President of the US, and they talked about their China policy coordination. It appears to be that in the UK also considers China as their top geopolitical rival. Though, UK is not a superpower, it's not a global power anymore. It's kind of hard to understand, from the point of view of Beijing. Like, people see UK as a trading partner, very important partner in the European continent, and there's a potential we can continue to do business. But somehow the UK sees China very differently from the Chinese perspective, probably the other side. Yeah.
As Britain is internally weaker, it'll look for more reinforcement externally, and with the war in Ukraine, this whole combination of forces where Britain will unfortunately throw its lot in with the US increasingly. Unless he's got something up his sleeve he's not shared, some spark of originality in foreign affairs. The good thing is China doesn't seem to react too much. It doesn't take too seriously that Liz Truss, I think she said as she went in as Prime Minister that she considered Britain on a war footing with China, which is absurd. I think the closest soldiers to Britain, I think, was the border of Kazakhstan. So that absurdity is probably gone from the conversation. But the good thing is China doesn't really react too much. Britain matters less and less. So I don't think it's a big deal. I think it looks like a coalition in the West gathering around the US, and Britain's part of that. I think Australia is probably quite fused to the US in foreign policy. The others are not. It's very significant that Scholz is the first European visitor, and now that Xi Jinping has gone into his third term. That's a huge gesture, and that would worry Washington because many other countries, perhaps with a bit more balance and less internal political instability, I think, are waiting for their next step with China, because China is so important for them commercially. Mm-hmm. So I think, unfortunately for Britain, it matters less and less to China.
Yeah. John, in London, Sunak talked tough about China policy, but will UK, or does UK have the capability, to deal with China in the harsh way, for example, to sever economic relationship with China? I think China will suffer much less than the UK if that really happened.
Yeah, certainly it will. No, it won't make any great difference to China if there was a complete breakdown in economic relations. There will be some annoyances. London is the world's most important centre for foreign exchange dealings, for example, even more important than New York. And therefore, as China pursues a policy of strengthening the international role with the RMB, it's very convenient to have a good base in London. And it was rather symbolic because actually, if you go to the Bank of England, one of the first things you see in the roads near it is the Chinese flag because there are Chinese banks there. So there would be some inconveniences, but it wouldn't disastrously affect China. But of course, it would be a lose-lose situation. Britain loses out of the situation. It's already lost because of cutting Huawei out of the telecommunications system at the demand of the United States. The British telecommunications companies didn't really want it, but the Americans insisted upon it. So everybody in Britain is now paying a higher price for their mobile telecommunications than when Huawei was here. So that's a lose. China would lose if it wasn't able to use so easily the facilities of the City of London, and that would all be negative. The problem is that Britain, with Brexit, has tied itself even more closely to the United States, and the United States wants bad relations with China. So I'm afraid I'm not terribly optimistic. I think Sunak will try to square the circle by trying to keep good economic relations with China because he's more economically coherent than Truss was. But I'm afraid he's tied to the US in foreign policy, so I wouldn't expect a dramatic improvement in relations, unfortunately. I wish I could tell you the opposite, but I can't, honestly.
Well, next, let's move on. China has reported better than expected GDP growth in the third quarter of this year. Meanwhile, the National Development and Reform Commission, China's top economic planner, has issued a series of measures to boost foreign investment. What should we make of China's third quarter economic performance and forecast for future growth? How significant is foreign investment for China's pursuit of high-quality growth and modernization? Again, I'm joined by Professor John Gong, David Mahom, and John Ross. So, John, in Shanghai, we'll start with you. Official data released this week shows that the GDP rose 3.9% in the third quarter, year on year, better than expected. What do you make of this number?
Well, I'm really surprised at this number. I think one of the lessons I have learned in reading and maybe forecasting these numbers is that there are things we don't see that are happening. And it's shown that most of that growth, the meager 3.9% growth, is mostly coming from two areas. One is the manufacturing, the infrastructure investment in Southwest China and other places. These are things as we average folks probably don't observe. We are probably too much welded by our observation about what's happening in Beijing and Shanghai in the service sectors, what's happening in the malls, what's happening on the street stores. And that's just not enough, I think. That's the first thing. Second thing, I still want to mention China's export sector, 5.9% growth. I mean, in September, this is still very, very strong growth in consideration of the global economy is slowing down. And the export sector never fails to surprise me, pleasantly, of course. So I think I learned the lesson here, and that we hope even amidst all the pandemic-related problems in China, the engine of growth and engine of manufacturing is still cranking, and I hope it's still continue to crank even amidst a very adverse economic environment globally.
David, speak of the momentum. Of course, people will ask, will the economic momentum continue? And what about the potential of the Chinese economy? As China probably will be, taking measures to ease the restrictions over the COVID-19 pandemic. If not this year, probably early next year. People, that's the expectation. Ultimately, you have to lift those restrictions out, and then let the economy, give them a full, unleash the full potential. Let's say.
Yes, and I mean, we travel to all parts of China whenever we can. In the last few weeks, it's been difficult, but Xinjiang, Yunnan province, Shandong, off to Sichuan next week. And there is a lot of activity at a local level, far more than is apparent in our more restricted lives in Beijing and Shanghai. So I think that it is true that there's a fundamental driver, a momentum here. People are adapting. I remember talking to an exporter in Zhejiang, one of the largest saying that many suppliers had gone bankrupt, but within weeks they were replaced by others to supply the same goods. So the fundamental supply side in China and the stability in manufacturing, while people are going out of business, better capitalized people are taking over those companies. So you've got this still this grassroots growth and energy, which as we go into a looser environment domestically, more free to travel, less pressure on logistics chains, China will come back as an engine of its own domestic economy, and therefore the global economy way better than any of the forecasts we're reading today. If you look at the so-called Western takeaways of the Congress that's just been completed, they read into very ordinary, anodyne political statements and trends, talking about China closing its doors and China interfering with its own economy, which is actually quite fantastic because that is not the case. Although these numbers, I think, are inflated. There's a lot of stimulus, and that's part of it. And I suspect while the integrity in Beijing, I wouldn't question. I don't believe that the ministries and the key economists in Beijing distort anything. They're looking for the truth. I think, again, at a grassroots level, people are trying to be optimistic and perhaps over-reporting to make things look better than they are. But the fundamental trend is still the same. Next year, we'll see China returning to be one of the engines of global economic growth.
John, in London, if you look at the, break down the numbers, the data, investment contributed to like a 26.7% share of China's economic growth during these first 3 quarters of this year. Consumer spending dropped to 41, a little more than 41%, 41.3. If you compare that number to last year's consumption spending, which accounted for more than half, more than 50% of the GDP, obviously there's a drop of this contribution from consumption. What do you make of that? More from the investment and less from the consumption, the change?
Oh, I think this is a positive trend. If you look at when an economy turns down, what happens is that investment falls sharply, much more sharply than consumption. US figures were just published, incidentally, so we can make a comparison. If you look at it real year-on-year growth, because the US publishes its figures in a way that distorts the year-on-year growth, the US economy only grew by 1.8% in the last year-on-year in the last quarter, whereas China grew by 3.9%. So China's economy is growing more than twice as fast as the US, and US investment actually fell. This is what you would expect as the economy turns down. So I think it's very positive for the future growth because investment is an input into GDP, whereas consumption is not an input into GDP. It just means that a certain percentage of the economy is consumed. So the fact that China's investment is holding up well despite the economic slowdown, particularly compared to the United States, means that China's economy will continue to outperform considerably any other major economy in the coming period. So I think basically the figures are very good.
David, here from the country's top economic planner, the NDRC, 15 measures were published to draw more foreign investment or stabilize foreign investment. There are incentives, for example, for financing innovation centers, smart manufacturing, as well as moves to ease travel by executives, technicians, and their families. So what do you make of this latest measures, and what's the signal from the country?
I think it's very positive. Again, in our own experience, we're involved in foreign investors coming to China. We help them to find partners. We help to provide the due diligence and strategies for those investments. And in all cases, we are welcome. The caution out of some countries, not so much not to invest in China, but to delay. The delay because of COVID and freedom of travel has been an issue. Everywhere we go, as long as you are doing something that's useful, as long as the investment is in something significant, substantial, not in terms of scale, but in terms of its relevance, it's tremendously open. I mean, China's become an easier place to do business, an easier place to have disputes. We're involved in some arbitration disputes as well. Even that now is a better process than it was in years before. So again, there is this, especially Anglophone media view, that the president is not a reformer. He is not someone that backs an open economy, doesn't believe in markets, and is more for some kind of old command model. The opposite is true. There have been more reforms in the last 10 years than anyone really could possibly begin to measure in terms of banking, in terms of the ease and transparency of business. So it's only a matter of visas being more available and quarantine requirements lowering. I think you will see a number of foreign businesses coming back, particularly because there are recessions now and a patchwork across Europe. Parts of America are in recession, and many parts of the developed world are going to go into recession for maybe 12 months. So China becomes more and more attractive.
Well, John, in Shanghai, obviously, attracting or stabilizing foreign investment on one hand is literally what it means to boost economic growth. On the other hand, it seems to be also like a response to the U.S. efforts to decouple from China, to encourage or to pressure other countries to divest from China away, and then invest in other parts of Asia, either high-end industry or middle or low-end industry to other Asian countries. China has to respond to that kind of tactics, basically like a Cold War measures against China.
Absolutely. Foreign direct investment has always been a recipe of success for China's economic growth. In the early days, it's probably more about capital. Later on, some technology transfer or some innovation-related activities. Now, I think it's taking advantage of the China's market, largest consumer market, as well as high-end manufacturing. Competition between China and the United States should be in the area of attracting and keeping foreign direct investment as well. And particularly at a time, I would say that many European companies, particularly in Germany actually, are seeking other places for investment. We're going to see a big business delegation together with Prime Minister Scholz, Chancellor Scholz, a visit to China in a few days. And I think that visit in itself testifies to at least the German business community's confidence in the China's market as still a fairly attractive place for foreign direct investment.
Well, John, in London, obviously there's a divergence. Germany is a case in point. The government, their foreign minister and their economy minister, the vice chancellor from the Green Party, seems to me like at least they are more looking at the issue from the geopolitical lens or from ideological lens, in related to Washington's efforts against China. But the business community from Germany and other countries, they don't welcome this interference, political interference from the government based on the ideological differences, based on geopolitical consideration. Is that the case?
Yeah, it's certainly the case. I mean, Germany has been dealt very severe economic blows by the United States, by its so-called ally. I mean, two very, very serious damages have been done to Germany's economy by United States policy. Firstly, the United States has created the great crisis in Europe through the expansion of NATO, which has cut off cheap gas from Russia to Germany, which means Germany is now going to have to pay more expensive to import more expensive US gas. This is very bad for the German economy. And secondly, China is Germany's single biggest country export market. And the United States wants bad relations between Germany and China. So therefore, the policies, it's not really the policy ideological within politics within Germany, it's been driven by the United States, is carrying out policies which are very bad for German business. So yes, German business would like both very good relations with China, and it doesn't like the fact that the politicians, or that is the United States politicians, get in the way of this. So again, Scholz is trying to square the circle. He's trying to satisfy German business and keep the German economy going forward.
With that, we come to the end of today's show. Many thanks to our guests. You can also find us on the CGTN app or on YouTube. Thank you for being with us. I'm Xu Qinduo. See you next time.